the Second World War. So many thanks for accepting my invitation.
Thank you very much, Raphael, for this invitation. And it's a real pleasure for me to share with you today some aspects of my very recent work on my thesis that I finished last year. And the title was "The License to Kill, the First Phase of the Extermination of the Jews in Eastern Galicia, June 22nd, August 1st, 1941. So I wanted to capture this switch over between becoming a shooter, a killer, a perpetrator, but also the switch over in the first phase of the extermination of the Jews on a regional scale. Therefore, I chose a very tight period. So, this subject led me to wonder about the driving forces of violence against the Jews, about the switch over of these men into mass murder. Unlike the Reserve Police Battalion 101, I was not dealing here with ordinary men, as far as Sonderkommando 4A was concerned. They had begun their career in the Stapos of the Reich, in the Waffen-SS. On the other hand, when the Reserve Police Battalion 101 first shot at Józefów, many shootings of Jews already took place in the East. The information channels at the time made them known through Wehrmacht soldiers. In particular. This is perhaps a dimension to explore in what way the chronology of the execution played a role in the acceptability of the murderous act, or in other words, the fact that other, and I mean many, units killed before massively kent the moral dilemma of the new perpetrators. So when the Sonderkommando 4A shot more than 3,000 Jews in Sokal, Eastern Galicia, between June 28 and June 30, 1941, it was one of the very first mass executions of Jews in occupied Soviet territories since the start of Operation Barbarossa, except, for instance, the shooting of 200 Jews in Gardzai in Lithuania on June 24. But other shootings precede them in Poland from September 1939. But also violence, which the historian Johann Böhler would describe as Blitzpogromen, took place just before the arrival of Sonderkommando 4A. Indeed, about 536 people were murdered by Wehrmacht soldiers before the arrival of Sonderkommando 4A in Eastern Galicia, and also in Western Volhynia. More than 90% of these victims were Jewish victims. So what to do with these executioners who are difficult to identify, and how to explore the drivers of their actions? For instance, on June 23rd, German soldiers slaughtered 173 Jews in Tartakov. This is a very small village near Sokal, on the road to Lviv. They were shot near the synagogue. And a Jewish survivor testified in the Yizkor. I saw how a German murderer shot the rabbi's child held in his mother's arm. Then he shot the mother. So how can this sort of violence be explained? This violence was both targeted against Jews and indiscriminate. Women and children were among the victims. It could not be attributed to the brutality of the fighting, the brutality of the war. So was it the power of the representations, the fantasy of a bloodthirsty enemy? Admittedly, the anxiety aroused by the potential presence of sniper, or in German, Hakenschütze, the image of the Jew from the East, so the so-called Ostjude. You were talking about that, Raphael, and maybe this stereotype of Ostjude was determined to select the first Jewish victims. It could be a possibility because in some soldiers' correspondences, we can find sentences like, the Jews look like the Jews in the Stürmer, and so on. And the so-called defensive war against Judeo-Bolshevism designated the Jews as enemies to defeat. Moreover, the preparatory orders for Operation Barbarossa very clearly authorized the army officers to undertake reprisal against any element of the local population suspected of actions against the German army. This legislative basis authorized the killing of civilians, and the directives of the Nazi leaders present on the spot, like Heydrich or Himmler, designated the Jews. So the Wehrmacht soldiers, the men of Sonderkommando 4A, seem to have understood from the very first day of Operation Barbarossa that the Jews had to be eliminated. First, those who were considered the most dangerous, men of fighting age, members of the intelligentsia, but also women and adolescents like Komsomol were victims of this first wave of killings, including even children during the pogroms. The most desiring part of this research was to see the diversity of perpetrators, the German army, the Einsatzgruppen, the local population, and for Eastern Galicia, the Ukrainian committees, but also Romanian army, Slovak soldiers, Hungarian soldiers. So I focused on the role of representations in the unleashing of violence against the Jews, and I sought the motivations for these crimes. What it means for the perpetrators to kill these Jews. I had at my disposal two types of access, each fragile, problematic, but which I confronted as far as possible. The words of the perpetrators, mostly during their statements during the post-war trial in Germany, and the description of the crime itself by survivors, Jewish survivors, but also by the neighbors, I mean Ukrainian people who were on the spot at the time, and testimonies that I collected with the association Yachad in Ukraine, but also in other countries. So what could the way the crime had been committed reveal about their perpetrators? Today, I have chosen the context of the first shootings by the Sonderkommando 4A in Sokal, because they took place a few days after the outbreak of Operation Barbarossa and before the discovery of corpses in the NKVD prisons. Sonderkommando 4A left the vicinity of Prech the next day after the start of Operation Barbarossa. Equipped with about 20 cars and 6 to 8 trucks, the convoy took the highway passing through Breslau and Krakow. It followed the advance of the 6th Army, commanded by Generalfeldmarschall von Reichenau. Sokal was certainly on the commando's roadmap as a crossing point for the Bug, before going on to Lutsk to the northeast. According to the historian Gerhard Reitlinger, whose conclusions were taken up by the Zentrale Stelle of Ludwigsburg in the procedure initiated against former members of Sonderkommando 4A, von Reichenau and Blobel met for the first time on June 25 in the vicinity of Sokal, after von Reichenau's swim in the Bug River. According to Blobel and his deputy Effner, the two men agreed on the framework for future police measures in 6th Army area. According to Effner's statement, at the end of the meeting, Blobel went to Lublin to report on this topic to KDS Lublin, Hermann Worthoff. Around June 28, Effner, so the deputy of Blobel, was also the link man with the Sixth Army. So Effner met the arts commandant of Sokal. He informed him for the dangerous presence of sniper in the city. And he reported during his process. As the arts commandant immediately recognized my Zippo uniform, he told me that since the capture of Sokal on 22nd June 1941, 15 German soldiers were killed every day by snipers. That is why urgent help was needed to expand the circle of interrogations carried out. He also asked me if there were no Zippo forces available for this. He gave me the order to obtain an immediate intervention from the Sixth Army. The Sixth Army validated the case, and I transmitted the operation order to the Sonderkommando 4A. End of quote. The Sixth Army therefore acceded to the request of the Ostkommandantur in difficulty and sent the Sonderkommando 4A to Sokal. At least that was how Effner presented things during his interrogation. Obviously, it could also be a defense strategy from Effner. So the stopover in Sokal made the commando deviate from its roadmap. However, around 11 a.m., Blobel, the chief of the commando, sent the 4th Commando to Lutsk to prepare the logistic for the arrival of the rest of the commando. The Sonderkommando 4A came to reinforce a system of arrestations, executions put in place in Sokal since June 22nd, based on the close collaboration of the army, the German army, and the Ukrainian nationalists. The 4th Commando left Lutsk, and the rest of the Sonderkommando 4A, under the orders of Blobel, therefore settled in Sokal. The men occupied the building of the town cemetery, and the kitchen was set up on the courtyard. Blobel took up residence in a villa and made it his Dienstsicht. The operations of the Sonderkommando 4A in Sokal can be summed up in the following lines in the Ereignismeldungen UEDSSR number 24 of July 16, 1941. I quote, "At Sokal, on June 28, 1941, 15 communist functionaries, agents, and snipers were discovered among the civilian prisoners who were shot. On June 29th, with the help of the Ukrainian militia, another 117 active communist and NKVD agents were identified and executed the same day. Finally, on June 30th, with the contribution of local and reliable Ukrainians, 183 Jewish communists were apprehended and liquidated." So arrests took place before the arrival of the Sonderkommando 4A, as August Effner learned after sending the commando to Sokal. He said, I quote, "Many arrests had taken place thanks to the collaboration between the civilian population and the Wehrmacht." End of quote. Indeed, the German troops were greeted with enthusiasm by part of the population of Sokal. And some Jewish survivors remains. Ukrainian inhabitants, I quote, "Ukrainian inhabitants welcomed the German with flowers and hung German and Ukrainian flags outside their house." End of quote. A burgomaster was appointed this afternoon of June 22nd. The OUN appointed Stepan Rybetsky, a lawyer and journalist, and a sympathizer of the Ukrainian cause, an elderly person, and apparently very respected. And the Ukrainian director of the cooperative, Vasil Chernetsky, took the lead of the local police, the local militia. The rapidity with which the new structures were put in place and the visible understanding between the Germans and Ukrainian representatives suggests that there was nothing spontaneous about this, but that this collaboration had been prepared in advance through the intercession of the OUN, according to the German historian Kai Strube. So one of the first tasks of the Sonderkommando 4A was to organize a roundup. Small groups were formed to ensure the arrests. Men from the Sonderkommando 4A, accompanied by one of the interpreters, and local Ukrainians. They went from one apartment to another, following directions. The translators played the fundamental role of bridge between the commando and the local population. The commando had several interpreters. At least two of these interpreters were familiar with Eastern Galicia. Without local indications, it was impossible for these men to know which apartment where the Jews live in the city and which people has to be arrested. A large panel of the Sonderkommando 4A took part in this arrest. Waffen-SS soldiers, drivers, and even the commando's chief cook, dragged from his kitchen by pressure from his Waffen-SS colleagues who had originally come for a drink. We note during this first operation that the men of the commando must immediately perform tasks beyond the scope of their original position. Their numerical insufficiency can bring an explanation. At the time, around several hundred people were arrested, but it's not the only one. Victor Trill, Sonderkommando 4A driver, mobilized for the roundup, said, I quote, "In Sokal, we were mobilized with auxiliaries to apprehend specific people from their homes. There was a paper indicating which people to arrest." End of quote. Other testimonies suggest that the arrest concerned many people and that the men of the commando were not very careful about age or sex or gender of the people who has to be arrested. I quote, "On the day of our arrival or the next day, our commando had to come to the apartment of Sokal in search of civilians and bring them, including women and children, to a square where our trucks were parked. I also had to participate myself. I searched an apartment with our interpret, chased away 10, 11 people, and took them to the square in question. Among these people were 2, 3 children between the age of 7 and 10. The other members of the commando also brought civilians, including women and children. In total, there were between 180 and 200 people gathered in this square. I assume these civilians were Jews. Many looked like Jews." End of quote. On the other hand, the testimonies of Jewish survivors provide details regarding the identity of those who were arrested. Young Jewish members of the intelligentsia, and for Komsomol, Jewish Komsomol. They also point the crucial role played by the Ukrainian militiamen in designating the Jewish people to be arrested. The shootings carried out by the Sonderkommando 4A took place on the territory of a brickyard in the east of the city, around 2-3 kilometers from the city center. Clay pits were found around this brickyard. Anti-tank ditches had been dug by order of the Soviet authorities as part of their defense strategy, completing the fortified line of bunkers. It is likely like these trenches required modification for the executions. So one of my questions was, how did the Sonderkommando 4A men experience their first experience as killer? In the absence of letters from the time or diaries, only the statements of some of them within the framework of a justicial inquiry can enlighten us with all the limits they had in terms of falsification of facts, especially when it comes to personal involvement. Reading the events described by other witnesses can also make it possible to advance certain reflections. The ordinary men analyzed by Christopher Browning had on several occasions the opportunity to abstain. What about the men of Sonderkommando 4A? Most of their positions agreed to one point. Global involved everyone, and including, as I say, his own driver and the cook. They took part in the arrest, but also in the shooting itself. Those who did not shoot at Sokal had to be present and were mobilized to shoot in other killing, especially in Lutsk or in Zhytomyr. Why do they confess their crime? Was it precisely because Blobel had ordered them all to participate, thus dilating their responsibility in the collective, or because Blobel was dead at the time of the investigation and they could make him bear all the responsibility? So it's very difficult to distinguish what is part of a defense strategy or not. Blobel forced his own driver to shoot, and I quote this driver. Blobel had opened the execution. I drove him to the execution site in the car. Then he ordered me as a shooter. If I am now told that I should have resisted this measure, then I can only reply that it would have been in vain. Another man from the commando, previously working in the Shupo, described the role of Blobel. It was Blobel who took command in Sokal when the first shooting took place. I still remember that at the first shooting in Sokal, Blobel was assassinated about 20 men by a German Wehrmacht unit who were assigned exclusively for the shooting. I remember very well that Blobel personally appointed the shooters. He didn't let people argue. I remember this first execution very well because one of the shooters fell down and Blobel screamed for me at the top of his lungs. He asked me to provide a substitute for this shooter. As a Spitz, I had to attend the shooting like everyone else, but I wasn't assigned to shoot. As far as I know, all of Blobel's subordinate leaders were present. Blobel decided that they had to take part in this shooting. We comrades discussed this event the following evening, and everyone was amazed at how Blobel thought the solution to the Jewish question would be. And he gave more details on this episode. I know that one of the shooters passed out as pieces of a victim's brain reached him in the face. Blobel yelled at me and ordered me to get another rifleman. So why involve all the men? Was it to strengthen the cohesion of the group, to give them a common experience? Or was the intention for everyone to get their hands dirty? So the shooting and pogroms carried out in Eastern Galicia in the very first weeks of Operation Barbarossa show a will on the German side for a major mobilization of all visible public against the Jews. We can also imagine this execution as an apprenticeship. The men of the commando had to show autonomy. And Blobel spoke in Nuremberg on the case of Sokal. You can read here. So he's describing the shooting in Sokal. You mean that they're raising themselves easily to what was awaiting them? Yes, that was the case. That was the case with these people. Human life was not as valuable as it was with us. They did not care so much. They did not know their own human value. In other words, they went to their deaths quite happily. I would not say that they were happy. They knew what was going to happen to them. Of course, they were told what was going to happen to them, and they were resigned to their fate. And that is the strange thing about these people in the East. And did that make the job easier for you, the fact that they did not resist? In any case, the guards never met any resistance, or at least not in Sokal. Everything went very quietly. It took time, of course, and I must say that our men who took part in these executions suffered more from nervous exhaustion than those who had to be shot. In other words, your pity was more for the men who had to shoot than for the victims. Our men had to be cared for. Friedrich Buschmann, on January 30, 1963, expressed the same thing as Blobel. I quote, "The first execution lasted about 2 hours. No incident was reported. It even went rather well. The Jews had resigned themselves to their fate. Each time there were a group ready for the shooting. This group had no choice but to watch their predecessors to be shot. Those in the brickyard could not see the execution site. But other available sources describe this shooting differently. And for instance, Willy Spang was a Wehrmacht soldier and he attended the executions. He was just a witness. And I quote, "The shooters fired with 98 carabines at the standing victims. The latter fell either into the pit or around it. Some were mortally wounded, some were not. The officer who was standing at the top shouted after the execution, 'Ceased fire through the bodies.' It was a horrible sight." End of quote. And he said later, I quote, "I remember very well that one of the shooters flinched. He told the officer, 'I can't anymore, I don't feel well.' And the officer shouted, 'Break off, coward, next.' The one who felt bad was an older man. He took his omelette and walked away. He had a sweaty pale face." And end of quote. And then he described the victims. I quote, "There were Jews, I can tell you. I remember that the older Jews, dressed in kaftans, tried to console the younger ones, surrounding them in their kaftans and hanging them." And regarding the report of the Soviet Extraordinary State Commission on this particular shooting, we can read a different version of the execution. On June 30, 1941, 180 people from the city's intelligentsia were gathered, among them party members, comsomers, professors, teachers, lawyers, and others, who were taken outside the town of Sokal, where they were massacred. They were all beaten until they were half dead, then thrown into an anti-tank ditch, and then shot. When the pit was covered with earth, the blood rose to the moving surface. So we are very far from a military execution that we could find in the former Sonderkommando 4A statement. And also the Jewish survivor, Paulina Shoret, heard the fate of her classmates. According to the words of the Ukrainians, they suffered a terrible death. And the guard of the brickyard reported that the night after the execution had been dreadful as he heard the voices of those who were dying. So the discrepancy between the description of the killing by the shooters and by the other witnesses underlines the difficulty of working from these statements of this former member of Sonderkommando 4A alone. The killers all insist that Blobel left them no choice. Apart from the shooter who had to be replaced after having received a piece of brain in the face, no clue in the depositions of the former Sonderkommando 4A goes in the direction of a refusal or even a disgust or a misunderstanding. Involving all the men made it possible to unite the group around the same experience. The social dimension of this task force, unfaced by Christopher Browning in his study of Reserve Police Battalion 101, was of great importance. Even if several men already knew each other because they came from the same Gestapo of the Reich, they had only met a few weeks, even days before in Prague. All the members of the commando shared the same responsibility. In fact, more diffuse, less heavy when it was shared. It also housed each man in the same boat, giving them the same importance. Even the cook or the driver had a role to play in these commandos. The baptisms of fire made it possible to bring the men of the Sonderkommando 4A into the war. He had an initiatory role. So the brutality of these first shootings questions the notion of brutalization. The license to kill Jews, granted in orders preceding Operation Barbarossa, no doubt played a fundamental role. Killing civilians, especially Jews in Soviet territory, was permitted. To this was certainly added the power of the representation that the members of the commando had of their enemies, representations that they shared with other Nazi forces involved in Eastern Europe. I mean, the danger of Bolshevism, the figure of Ostjude, the anguish of Ekenschützer. It's interesting to see that this violence appears from the very first day of Operation Barbarossa, before the macabre discoveries in the NKVD prison, which launches the hypothesis that the extermination of the Jews of the East had been integrated by those men involved in this annihilation war against Soviet Union. So to conclude, I want to be quick in order to have some discussion or question. The example of Sokol supports the conclusions of Christopher Browning, and I quote, the disimagination of the other contributes greatly to the psychological distance which facilitates the killing. Rather than delirium or brutality, it is distancing that is one of the key of the behavior of the Reserve Police Battalion 101. And in this phenomenon of retreat, war and racial prejudice have mutually reinforced each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie. It was very interesting. So let's give you a round of applause. So I guess there are questions, so you can just write it on the chat, because otherwise I won't manage to, or you can also use another way. So if there are no questions, so I had a question by listening to, so what I found very, very interesting is that I have the impression that you really try to adapt the standpoint from the staff to raise the question, what was the goal of asking to everyone to kill? So you have a kind of management perspective. How did they manage the men? And with Christopher Browning's book, so we have the impression that there was this weak management from trap, and here you have this evil management, and that's which tries to create killers. So but then it raises, so for me it raises the question about how did they know that people would do that? Because when you ask to everyone to do the task, then you take the risk that people would disobey. And also in the same way, so I don't know if there was a kind of theory among Nazi staff about how to get people to obey. Because when you quoted this statement from Blobel, when he says that people, they didn't have they were nervously exhausted, so they couldn't carry anymore. So it's a terminology that you find also in the speech from other dignitaries, this idea of nervous breakdown. So I'm wondering whether it's not a kind of lexical technique to call that nervous breakdown instead of humanity, instead of emotion. So there is this verbal techniques that enable people to name what they do without giving them the tools to interpret it as evil, being evil. So this makes me think that maybe there was something that was thought before the events were taken place about how to get men, ordinary men, to just become killers. Yeah, so this is...
Yes, very good questions. I'm not sure if we can consider the members of the Einsatzgruppen as other ordinary men,
Yeah.
Policemen from the Reserve Police Battalion. Yeah, it's a very good question regarding the nervous breakdown of some of them, and maybe I could say that this man could agree to participate in the killing, in the shooting, but a killing site, a shooting site, is very disgusting. I mean, there is blood everywhere. Everyone is screaming. It's a really, it's the hell. Really, it's something very, very disgusting, even for the shooters, even if they are willing to conduct these shootings. You know, so it's very difficult to analyze this. This terminology, and this is, I think, this is the heart of our topic today. Are they really willing to shoot these people? Are they disgusted by what they are doing, or by the consequences of their acts? Very difficult questions. And regarding the management of Blobel, some sources say that Otto Rasch, so the chief of the Einsatzgruppe C, ordered that all the men have to shoot once, at least once. And I know that in some commandos, like Einsatzkommando 6, it was also the case, but not in each Einsatz oder Sonderkommando.
Thank you. So I think that Whiteman has a question.
Yeah, thanks for that really, really interesting presentation. And I just wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit more about the Ukrainian participation, and sort of like what are the sources that they had available to you to sort of get a sense, not just of the locals, but also the OUN, and sort of like organized Ukrainian collaboration versus villagers. With these from interviews with people now, or if you just talk a little bit more about that aspect, I think that's really interesting.
Yes. So the first time of the German occupation of Sokal, so the day of the Operation Barbarossa, so June 22nd, Ukrainian administration was already created this very day, a few hours after the Soviet retreat of the city in Sokal. And it was organized before, as I can see in the OUN archives, because the OUN organized the nomination of the Burgermeister, and the chief of the Ukrainian cooperative was appointed as a police, the chief of the militia, and he was researched after the war. And I have some documents from Jewish survivors who testified that he was particularly cruel, etc., and took part in all the shooting, but also the selections of the Jews for the Sonderkommando 4A. Actually, before these executions, it was the mayor who selected the Jewish victims on the market square, and not the Sonderkommando 4A. So the local participation was very important in Sokal also, because during these few days of executions, local people, especially from the villages, went to the city with carts and looted the Jewish apartments, the Jewish houses, the Jewish shops, etc. And some of them, so civilians, took part in beating and even killings on the streets. And unfortunately, I was not able to find people when I was in Sokal a few years ago, because many of them were already dead at the time. I came too late, unfortunately. But in other localities in Eastern Galicia, I could conduct some interviews of former neighbors of the Jews and get some information of the local involvement in the pogroms and even in the organization of the shootings.
Thank you. I think Jan has a question. You should turn on your mic.
I'm sorry, I don't hear you.
Sorry. In the case of this territoria north of Galicia, pogroms were recommended even by German authorities, like in the case of Jedwabne, which was a quite conscious policy in order to involve local communities. So it is nothing particularly strange, and it was successful, as we know. And only one remark about this participation of ordinary people and their feelings. So in Wannsee conference, one of reasons to organize death camps and killing by gazing was that maybe it is not quite convenient for ordinary German soldiers to kill children, women, and to see blood. I don't know how we can generalize this problem, but anyway, it was one of motivations for mass murdering by gazing.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And the use of gas vents before. Yeah, you're right. Eidrich wrote some orders to organize secretly pogroms, mobilizing the local population against the Jews in some point with like a public show against the Jews in the market square, and especially as you mentioned that, Raphael, the Jewish targets were the Jews in Kaftan, the Orthodox Jews, and I assume for propaganda reasons, because many pictures were taken at the time by propaganda company, but also by ordinary German soldiers.
So yeah, I had a question about the idea you started with about Christopher Browning's book. So the chronology of 101 battalion. So you I think it was very interesting what you said, that the fact that it happened in July 42.
Yes.
Yeah, it was, and when already other killings were already happening, it was also maybe a motivation. So. And it could be linked with the question of masculinity, because these men, they were not like young men, and they knew that other ones were already doing the difficult stuff. So maybe they felt compelled to imitate the other ones and not to be left behind, and they couldn't fight on the fronts, so they could at least fight against babies. And I cannot say that seriously, but so yeah, so they could at least do this task. So maybe this is, I know it gives a reason why if they knew already that it was happening, and if they were kind of they were already in a process of conformity, but at the scale of the whole army.
Yes, that was my question. The shootings of Jews were already common in summer 1942. This is why I asked the question, but maybe Christopher Browning has something to add about that, about this conformity to the other units involved in Eastern Europe.
Okay, Christopher, you should turn on your. Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think it is important to make these distinctions, both time-wise when something happens and the kind of unit and the people in it. In a sense, there's sort of three stages. And when the Germans go into Poland in 1939, we have the first waves of atrocities, much less than in 1940 when they're in France and Western Europe. And then starting in the summer of 41 in the Soviet Union, far more prepared to commit large-scale atrocity than they were in Poland. And so you said Einsatzgruppen, really, I wouldn't use the term ordinary men. These are career SS, SD people who have been carefully selected as to people who are likely to make a career in the East. A number of the men are fairly carefully selected. Towards the end, when they were filling out, sometimes people would get in because their local police commander wanted to get rid of somebody he didn't like at his police station. So when they were asking, who can you send, they would ship out somebody they wanted to get rid of. And we know Police Battalion 9 from Berlin was simply divvied up between the four Einsatzgruppen. So these were order police, but there were people in the order police since 1937. They'd been policemen for 4 years by the time they're attached to the Einsatzgruppen, unlike the people in 101 in the summer of 42 who have been in for a couple of months. And of course, they were much younger than the ones in 101. So I think that is important to make those distinctions. We do know that different units in the opening weeks, some did distinguish themselves. 309 at Bialystok, the Tilsit Commando on the Lithuanian border, Global's SK4A were in a sense at the forefront, and not everybody was doing, the same degree of enthusiasm, and some were making, in a sense, a name for themselves as being exceptionally go-getters, which Himmler would point to, and then Himmler and Heydrich would scold others that they weren't keeping up with what their neighboring units were doing. And so they would, Himmler and Heydrich could play off the units against each other and make it a kind of competition.
Yeah.
I think certainly the issue of trying to get all the men to shoot was much more common. Trapp's speech at Józefów is very, very unusual, where he gives the offer not to take part. Far more common was to try to make sure everybody was in it, everybody had their hands dirty, because that creates the kind of peer pressure that you don't want to be the one who's not the only person who isn't doing it, the only person who's letting down their comrades. So trying to induce all the men to take their turn, to shoot at least once, to break the ice, to get to take part, I think was a far more standard than certainly what Trapp did at Józefów, which was exceedingly unusual. In many of these other units, they're not invited not to take part, but it took a very courageous individual to say, I can't do that. And then they would be left alone. They weren't made to shoot if they said, I can't do it. And again, as we've talked earlier, the best way to say I can't do it is not that I can't do it because it's wrong. I can't do it because I'm too weak. I'm having a psychological crisis. I'm collapsing. I'm not manly enough. I'm not strong enough. Was the way out, and that's the room people had to excuse themselves.
Thank you.
Thank you. So if there are no other questions, so I think we should give a round of applause to Marie and one more time. It was a very interesting discussion. And I want to thank the 4 speakers and also the audience and the questions, and also Christopher Browning for being here, because it's very special for all of us that you were there and also that you woke up so early to be among us. So many thanks. And I will let you know when the videos will be online. So I will try to cut it in 3 parts, which will take me some time to figure out how to do that. But I will let you know so that you can see it again. So take care, everyone, and many thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.